Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Andrea Pirro. I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program by visiting artist Olalekan Jeyifous, also fondly known as Lake. Each year, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to share their expertise with us and to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. These programs serve as a critical resource for the SAIC community as well as our extended audience. Lake is a Brooklyn-based artist well known for reimagining social spaces and exploring the intricate relationships between architecture, community, and the environment. His insights will undoubtedly enrich our understanding of these vital connections. It is an honor to have Lake visit SAIC to share his visionary work with us, and I would like to thank him for taking the time to be here tonight. Before we get started, please kindly silence your cell phones at this time, and note that video recording of the lecture is not permitted. At the end of Lake's presentation, we'll have time to take 3 or 4 questions from the audience before the program concludes by 7:30. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will get a microphone over to you. If you're posing a question, please keep it concise so we can get to as many questions as time allows. Thank you. So introducing Lake this evening is Associate Professor Andres Hernandez, an interdisciplinary artist whose work critically examines the physical and social environments we inhabit. Much like our esteemed guest lecturer, Andres encourages us to engage deeply with our surroundings, envisioning alternative possibilities of our built world. Please welcome Andres Hernandez to the podium.
Okay, I have to have a moment of seriousness. Good evening, everyone. It's my honor to introduce tonight's Visiting Artist Program speaker, Olalekan Jeyifous, affectionately known as Lake by his family and friends, some who are here tonight. I've had the great pleasure of knowing Lake since about 1994 or 95, a long time ago, when I met him during his first year as an architecture student at Cornell University. My earliest memories of Lake were of this cool, super chill, multi-talented artist who could hold it down on the MIC as well as with the May line for all the old school draftspeople in the audience. For me, Lake and his crew of newbie architecture students represented the next school of Cornell Blackarchitects, as we like to call ourselves. And his early creative practice in the studio and beyond proved exemplary of this honorific. Lake was and still is built different, as the young folks say. And I quickly realized that his inner visions, which materialized into whimsical, tectonic, and culturally grounded projects, were just on another level. But like an other level that we all weren't quite ready for, and perhaps still aren't. I've continued to be amazed at how Lake innovates and pushes through the visual and conceptual boundaries of both art and architecture to rethink our worlds otherwise, often harnessing the significant material, spatial, and cultural epistemologies of African descent peoples in the process. Lake is a Brooklyn-based artist whose work reimagines social spaces that examine the relationships between architecture, community, and the environment. In addition to an extensive exhibition history of his phenomenal drawings, collages, architectural models, and AR and VR visualizations, Lake has spent over a decade also creating large-scale installations for a variety of public places and spaces, including Socrates Sculpture Park, Coachella, and his current co-commission with fellow artist and Cornell Blackarchitect Amanda Williams to design a monument for Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm as part of the City of New York's She Built NYC initiative. Lake has exhibited at esteemed venues, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Vitra Design Museum, the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain, and the Museum of Modern Art, where his artwork is featured in the permanent collection of the Department of Architecture and Design, and was part of Reconstruction's Architecture and Blackness in America, which was MoMA's first exhibition to explore the relationship between architecture and the spaces of African American and African diasporic communities. I'll also add, it's not in my notes, but Lake is also a co-founder, out of that exhibition, a co-founder of Black Reconstruction Collective, which is an amazing organization now that helps to fund further explorations in terms of race and space. Lake has garnered numerous awards, including the notable Silver Lion at the 2023 Venice Architecture Biennale for his immersive installation, ACE AAP, a retrofuturist African eco-fiction imagining a network of low-impact, zero-emission travel complexes situated off the coast of major worldwide ports. Additionally, he is a recipient of the 2021 Fellowship by the United States Artists and has been a Wilder Green Fellow at the MacDowell Colony and completed other artist residencies at the Bellagio Center, supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Drawing Center's Open Sessions program. There are so many more projects and accolades I could highlight. You didn't come here to hear me, you came to hear Lake, but without further ado, please join me in welcoming my fellow Black architect, Lake, to the stage. Thank you.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? This is fantastic. Thank you all for coming out. Of course, thank you to the Art Institute for inviting me to be here. This is truly a family affair. I have got my mom in the audience, my brother, my sister-in-law, Amanda, Drez, Malik. This is a homecoming. So I got like 100 slides, so let's get right to it. The lecture is The Road Became a River. It's a title that I've been using for my last few lectures, and it comes from one of my favorite books. It's by a Nigerian author, playwright, poet, Ben Okri, from the Famish Road. And the quote goes, "In the beginning there was a river. The river became a road, and the road branched out to the whole world. And because the road was once a river, it was always hungry." So I've switched the nouns for the road became a river because I feel that it embodies so much of my practice, particularly in my architecturally inspired, artistic worldcraft, world building, where, you know, in the book, The Famished Road, the road is famished. And it deals with this sort of destructive path of kind of a relentless and rapid urbanization. And so what I do in so much of my work is then a kind of unmaking of both the conventions of architecture as far as it's understood in the Western context, a sense of rewilding and a sense of working more, again, as mentioned in the introduction, you know, through more holistic relationships between architecture and the environment and community. And so, in my case, the road became a river. I like to start at the very beginning, at Cornell University School of Architecture. Malik, Amanda, Andres. As Andres mentioned, I arrived there in 1995, and that is very significant to point out because as a Gen X person, I was born in 1977. It's important to note that my architectural education, 5 years from 1995 to 2000, bridged the digital divide almost dead center. So my first 2.5 years of architecture school were involved with the conventions at that time of architecture, of using the Mayline, drawing, drafting, sketching, you know, using line weights to depict the cross-section narratives as well as the chipboard and balsa wood models. The next 3 or so years, around year 3, I was one of the students that definitely became very fascinated with the relevant potential for computer software to the field of design, right? And Cornell is very unique in that a lot of the kind of technology was developed there through Don Greenberg, who is still alive, which is impressive. He actually did, you know, that's why they call that the Cornell box, which is, you know, early programming that dealt with, you know, real world rendering and photons. So this happened at Cornell. 1972, an early rendering of the Philip Johnson Museum was on the cover of Scientific America. So I say all of that to say that the precedents for computer design, to sort of assist with design and design narratives was very new, and it's very much kind of at the core of my practice. I like to start with my thesis, which is called Abiku Phenomenon, because I think it really embodies almost the entirety of my professional practice and how I define a lot of my artwork, which is very much self-initiated, maps onto my education at Cornell University. And also in terms of my process of combining, as mentioned, analog and the conventions of architectural representation with digital software, but in a kind of expansive understanding of digital software. Again, it was incredibly new, and its introduction into architecture, of course, was for legibility of building models, to articulate your designs to your professors, but to clients. But I was much more fascinated with the inconsistencies of it, the gaps that could allow for a kind of thematic layering of conceptual narratives. So my thesis, Abiku Phenomenon, dealt with this Yoruba cosmological belief of the Abiku child, which is it's when a family may lose 2 or more children at a very young age. It's believed that the child is inhabited by an Abiku spirit. Yorubas believe that life is cyclical. You are born, you live, you have children, you die, you join the ancestors, and you repeat it. But the Abiku child, they disrupt this narrative because they make a pact with their brothers and sisters from the spirit world to return as soon as possible. Now, what does that have to do with architecture? So here's where you get real esoteric, right? And you understand about how I think and process these things. The Abiku phenomenon is actually a kind of intentional misinterpretation or misappropriation of the myth in terms of Nigeria's social-political evolution. Abiku phenomenon, which is a very tragic belief, is seen as a positive thing. Nigeria at the time of where I'm looking for my thesis, looking at its kind of independence from colonial rule, and then the sort of ensuing military coups. So the sort of rebirth of the country as it establishes itself as an independent African nation. The Abiku myth is seen as a positive thing, right? And so I took that to mean a traditional belief that's intentionally misappropriated to have a positive contemporary application. And I use that as a way of a kind of formal exercise in architecture. So I constructed a 3D model of a palace in Ife. I found old photographs and I made a 3D model of it. And Form Z was one of the early CAD programs in architecture. It's like hearing an old school rapper for like hip hop, architecture hip hop has like, ooh, Form Z. But it had this function called Quick Paint. Quick Paint was incredible for how utterly useless it was, right? Because when it would make renderings of your 3D model, it did not calculate along the Z-axis. So the X and Y axis it calculated, the Z it did not. So for instance, if you were to make a model of a building and you rendered it, and it could throw fragments of the front porch, you know, in the back of the house and fragments of a window in the back. It just really, it made no sense, right? Because computer and architecture is supposed to be about legibility. So I used that to create these really disjointed fragments. And I made renderings throughout different rooms throughout this 3D model and developed these fragments. And then painstakingly traced them and projected them from perspective back into plan and used that to construct new sort of formal spaces. I didn't really have a building. I kind of made buildings just to satisfy some of the more traditional professors, if you will, right? But it was really about this, and you can see the lines. This is trace overlaid, so you see the markings and the erasing and the smudges and a lot of the labor in figuring out how to translate that back into a plan and develop new works. And so that really shaped my approach, both, again, in terms of the digital, the analog, and the conceptual. Whew, I try not to spend so much time on that thesis, but it's hard to explain it anyway. So I enjoyed that practice, my architectural education, and so pretty early on decided to be a full-time artist. The immediacy of seeing my visions come to life were very important to me. So 2 early projects I had was the Adverse Speak and the Public-Private Partnership and City Settlements and Urban Growth Strategies. I think they're great examples of 2 different sort of stylistic visual languages deployed for very specific reasons, but also important for understanding that I'm coming from the architecture world into the art world. I didn't have an MFA, so I don't know that what I do is art. I like it, you know what I mean? But is it art? Fine art is very exclusionary and very protective of its space because it's connected to the market, right? So it doesn't just let anybody come in and make art, So in these projects, the first one, Adverse Speak and the Public-Private Partnership, was exhibited at the Kitchen. It was an experimental space in New York, and it was called The Future is Disruption. And in the foreground there is Simone Yvette Lee's work. So one time I was in an exhibit with her. We was kind of at the same place, but she won the Golden Lion at the, was it last year, 2 years ago, or last year? 2 years ago. The Golden Lion of the art version of the Venice Biennale. But this was really about, this project was about a kind of relentless surveillance, relentless bureaucracy. Adverse Speak was basically this idea of, the way we promote brands naturally when we talk about them. You tell someone how great your Apple Watch is, your Beats headphones is. So this is a collaboration between another Cornell alumni and good friend, Maddie Vaz, and we developed this world where the dollar is failing for all these different reasons, and so Adverse Speak becomes the primary way of gaining currency. And so we really looked at a lot of different things, particularly like mobility and movement. We looked at South Africa's pass law system. In order to buy into the Adverse Speak system, you had to take an aptitude test. And again, language and the way these things were named were very important part of the art itself. So you took the average applicant aptitude for Adverse Speak advocate candidacy, and wherever you landed on that, RSR 0 to RSR 5 determined where you would work within this island that the investors bought, and it's owned by the GAP map, which is also GAP, but also the Greater Area Protocol map. So again, very early architectural-inspired art, incredibly detailed, using a very kind of 8-bit aesthetic, and imagining the artwork as tear sheets from the handbook. So breaking down how Adverse Speak would work. So if you had a brand like Coca-Cola, it's a kind of matrices depending on how well you're able to articulate and promote the brand. And its reception, neutral, negative, or positive. And that's called a construct to calculate the quantifiable quality of Adverse Speak quotient. And as in any new government body and agency, there are enemies of it. And so this was actually taken from a, I think, Cold War era kind of association matrix. And so this is the enemies of progress association matrix. So we had this really dense world built. Adverse Speak was paid out in a cryptocurrency. So kind of looking at the dollar bill and the occult symbolism on it, I wanted to base this off of the mandala and then have, just all this information about the different entities, the founders who've bought into the system. And similar to our E pluribus unum, Adverse Speaks was Imperium Sin Fine, which is an empire without end. And then the image next to it was just kind of this really detailed breakdown of how the world works. So the aspect of architecture and note-taking and research that goes in the project featured that work. This was more me now exploring a kind of painterly aesthetic using digital technologies, and my interest with city settlements, different type of urban areas, particularly the favelas, the Middle East, a kind of labyrinthine organization of these spaces. And so this is actually a computer rendering that's very low resolution, then run through this filter program called Vector Magic that takes very low resolution images and makes them, vector infinitely scalable files. So when you have a low resolution image, the finer the detail is, it just approximates it. And so it gives this sort of chiaroscuro painterly quality to it. And so I just did a series of these kind of scenes of what I imagined were future settlements. But a key aspect of my work and practice is an engagement with temporal narratives, not necessarily the idea of kind of a far-flung or near futures and kind of predicting speculative conditions, but actually looking at the past or looking at alternate pasts. In this early work, there's no scale figures. It's much more about the kind of architectural visual language. Accompanying those images were 12 planimetric drawings, digital drawings I created called urban growth strategies. And so they looked at different ways of organizing kind of cityscapes and urban planningscapes. And the interesting thing is that I actually used microscopic images of cellular images of liquids of different viscosities and how they interacted with one another as kind of underlays for determining this kind of visual language. So shout out to the art and science, my brother who's a phenomenal photographer and neuroscientist. And I was just fascinated by the kind of organic organizing properties of these cellular images, right, for how they could determine space on a macro scale. So those were the early days, 2008. I quit my job, worked for a multidisciplinary design firm, D-Box. Quit that job in 2004, decided to be an artist full-time. I probably quite wasn't ready, and so 2008, the subprime collapse happened, and I got laid off from my freelance work because I hadn't worked in 4 years, and then my friends got laid off. We started an architectural practice. I say all that to say there was a gap between returning to doing art full-time. So around 2012, I started applying for residencies. 2016, I was kind of back in the art game full-time. And so one of my first solo exhibits was at a gallery in London called 50 Goldburn. And I decided to pivot away from the digital artworks, particularly because it was kind of difficult to place that within the sort of art world and the reception of that kind of work, because people were like, oh, is that a painting? No, it's digital. Oh, okay, but it didn't look digital enough. It wasn't super 8-bitty. It was kind of almost like I was trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, even though I was transparent about it being digital works. But I also wanted to return to architecture and model making and collaging. So this was an exhibit called Not My Business, and that is taken from the title of a poem by another Nigerian author, poet, playwright, Ni Osundare. And it's about kind of speaking up around injustices, but similar to the road became a river and the river became a road, I like to reinterpret it towards my own end. So it reflected, in a sense, me kind of engaging with Nigeria, a place that I had not been to since I had left when I was around 6, 7 years old. So not my business is kind of my, the appropriateness of the way I engage with this space that exists largely at this time in my memory. So all of these photographs, with the exception of the black and white one of the University of Ile-Ife, were taken by my mother back in, 1976, 77. So I created a series of architectural follies and collages that really reflected me thinking through, news clips from Nigeria, photographs my mom had taken, but different memories. And so, we had this sort of fear of God. I remember the kind of tuk-tuks navigating through the streets of Lagos when we would go there to call my mom's parents. Play juju. Music was very much a fixture in our household. Every Sunday, listening to, different high life records, but every Sunday, also Peter and the Wolf. My mom played, we'd have pancakes. So again, thinking through, my relationship kind of removed from Nigeria, strike worker, of course, reflects so much of the kind of political conditions. One way, and again, these are black construction paper on watercolor, cold pressed watercolor. So they may look digital, but they are hand-made works. Onions Are My Husband references. It's actually a book by Gracia Clark, a Ghanaian woman that looks at the contributions of market women to the colonial independence struggle, which is a very often overlooked narrative. They're very important as well to the independence of Nigeria, the British trying to tax this informal economy, and the market women saying, we're not going for that. Nayude Drive, again, the taxis and lorries, which often feature scriptures on the side of the bus because of the precarity of navigating these streets. Overpriced Golder reflects the sort of expatriate community drinking around their pool clubs, Overpriced Gilder. And then Mobile Market, a generator. So again, just a blend of all of these different memories into these architectural follies, collages, and small-scale sculptures. So then, around this time, I wanted to really scale up and bring in my, I'm heavily influenced by science fiction, particularly how it functions as a means to take issues and concerns in the present and exacerbate them and project them into a future. Either wildly exacerbate them in a kind of dystopian approach, or resolve them, but in very tenuous ways, right, where there's some wild sacrifice. And I also wanted to challenge kind of Western perceptions of science fiction, architecture, art, design, what have you. So I created this project, Shanty Megastructures for Lagos, and it really was about kind of this massive, large-scale urban development, right, that in the best case scenarios overlooks marginalized, impoverished communities. Some 65% of Lagos population lives in these informal slum settlements. And to the right there is a fishing village, Makoko Village, which is off of the 3rd mainland bridge, which connects Lagos to the mainland, Lagos Island to the mainland. And it initially started, again, I mentioned these were really self-initiated projects. So I wanted to create a kind of organic structure that was in the center of the 3rd mainland bridge, that instead of connecting these 2 points was a destination in and of itself, and then kind of would flow into the Makoko fishing village. And it really became much more about creating these very simple visuals of this kind of massive architectural settlement at the scale of large-scale luxury real estate office developments, but using the building typologies, the construction material language of informal settlements. It became the shanty megastructures. And I found photographs that I'd sourced from the web for these renderings and placed this construct, these series of settlements, into what are considered privileged luxury real estate areas within Lagos, Nigeria, in a way in which they begin to overtake the kind of urban landscape. Simultaneously, the idea is extending visibility to these communities as well. And having them be part of the kind of language of development and progress and evolution of these cityscapes and spaces, and also looking at the fact that a lot of, incredible innovation, not only as a function of necessity, but also true creativity comes out of these spaces. I also made a series of animations. I actually found what would be the antithesis of my shanty megastructures, which is the Eco-Atlantic developments in Lagos, Nigeria. It's this massive development that's, of course, displacing many communities and causing all sorts of irreparable environmental damage to the coastline as well, right? So I found some of their promo videos, and then I found any moment in their B-roll where I could cut out the 2 or 3 seconds, 10 seconds, and then I could place in my intervention and create my own promo video, and then I re-uploaded it to YouTube with the same SEO search words and all of the same keywords. So when people would look for that, they would find my guerrilla intervention into Nigeria's new developments. So, this project then involved Dr. Mpo Matsipa in the upper left-hand corner, was an early fan and critic of the work of this implausible, absurd architecture. And she was like, we as artists and practitioners and architects and educators, we need to bring this stuff to the continent. It can't just be a one-way exchange where the Art Institute and Cornell and Columbia, we go to Africa and do our little traveling, studios. We need to engage with the students there. And so she said, I want you to collaborate. I want you to find a local person from, Nigeria to collaborate with, and let's do some workshops there and a lecture at the architecture school. So I said, I know just the guy, Wale Lawal, you see us on the canoe there. I said, I want to partner with this dude, because Shanty Megastructures was shown in CNN's online platform, but they, just for clickbait, they said, is this the new skyline of Lagos? And Twitter eviscerated me. Who is this fake Nigerian? Huh? Who is this this ruin porn for Western consumption? But then Wale DM'd me on the low, and he was like, yo, I think the fact that he said, I think this work is incredible. I think it's the kind of investigation that we need. And he's like, it makes sense that you haven't lived here, because I don't think anyone here would have done that. And that's not a bad thing, right? He said, it's important. So I was like, this guy. So I felt affirmed. But no, part of this workshop, again, was not only bringing it to the continent, but really challenging the way the world understands and sees engagement with the continent, which is always, particularly in architecture, it's NGO, it's nonprofits, it's I'm gonna go build my school there, I'm gonna go build a health clinic, I'm gonna go. It hasn't been inventive, it hasn't been exciting, you're allowed to make mistakes, it hasn't been messy and iterative, and really engaging with this lived space. It's taking the approach of the way we see sculptures in the US in museums behind glass vitrines. So there's much more about that. So we did the workshop, and then we also held a screening. Wale and I collaborated on 3 animations. We held a screening right under Falomo Roundabout Bridge, and people just came off of the streets, a very busy place with a lot of like market sellers and traffic. So people just meandered over. I had these VR headsets. I made VR scenes where children could really get inside Shanty Megastructure and get a sense of the massive scale of it. Wale created a graphic novel that I illustrated. We did do the lecture at Unilag. I did get eviscerated there again. A young woman stood up and she was so mad that she literally was crying. That's how mad she was. And she was like, this is so deeply offensive. Ruin porn, you know? And so after she made the comment, after I gave my lecture, she was the first question, and she said that. She got a standing ovation from all of her classmates. But because I am a trial by fire kind of person, I was like, all right, here we are. It'd be presumptuous for me to believe there wouldn't be this kind of critique and engagement. And I was about to respond, but then another student stood up and said, hey, how many of us have been to Makoko who grew up here? You know, the slum study. I mean, like 2 people raising hands, like, so we don't even know. We don't even engage in this way. And I just like, and he also said, why does this seem dystopian and negative to you? For me, it uses, you know, materials that are available, local materials, and expands the community grows and evolves. I don't know why it has to be a negative thing. Why are we looking? I think we may be mired in perceptions of the West and their kind of sense of futuristic. And I was like, whew, thank you. So he got like half to 3/4 of the room, but it really created a spirited debate, but he really like helped me kind of slide on by. So in developing this, you know, Shanty Megastructures was really looking at the architecture, but I wanted to get into the interiority and really develop more personal narratives at the scale of the human body. So I started these lo-fi Xerox collages of images that either I had taken or again sourced from the web. Is a fancy lecture way of saying I downloaded some cool pictures of people I found on the internet. But and then started, you know, and then used again 3D modeling to outfit them with, you know, these different contraptions that deal with creating fresh air or filtering water, or this kind of mobile hover truck that features a kind of gardenscape on it for creating fresh produce. You know, the woman on the Okada, but it's a pod racer. The rootkit kid who's carrying the internet around, you know, the kind of mobile Wi-Fi system. So again, sci-fi features heavy in my work. And it wasn't until I gave a lecture at UC Riverside that I even heard the term solar punk. One of my mother's colleagues invited me to give a talk there to the media studies department. And I had not heard the term solar punk. And it was actually the first time that I had the media studies crowd felt that this work wasn't dystopian at all. It was very utopian again. And they mentioned solar punk is a subgenre of science fiction that it really involves green technologies and much more considerations for environmental stewardship. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's it. And then I learned about salvage punk, which is really taking the excesses, capitalist detritus, and remaking them, right? Because a lot of our products are financialized, so it means they are released with a sense of controlled obsolescence, which is why your iPhone 8 needs to be your iPhone 9, needs to be your iPhone 12, you know what I mean? Even though none of the earlier models are broken. So filtering in this language of using what's available to create new technologies rather than developing new technologies. A lot of it's already there. So in keeping with the lo-fi ethos and aesthetic, the gallery space for these were the stickers that I printed up and slapped on you know, light poles and mailboxes throughout Brooklyn or wherever I may find myself. Became the kind of audience for this work. I will pivot into public art. That is what allowed me 2 things: to pay rent and healthcare, because I'm freelance and an artist, but also to reconnect with my architectural background, particularly working with clients, working with budgets, working with communities, working with sites. Those things are often seen as restrictive, but for us, they are design challenges. So I always tell Amanda, like, we have an advantage having an architectural background because we're not like the artists, like, no, you must implement my design as I see it. Exactly. We're like, no, we really work with the idea that this is being designed for communities, often to reflect their values and their interests and their unique histories. So the Boom and the Bust was a project I did for the 2019 Art Prize in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's called Cross Lines. And I was interested with their history of redlining, particularly these kind of competing narratives of the boom. A lot of wonderful development is taking place, but oftentimes either at the expense or overlooking the other narrative, the way kind of housing prices and availability of affordable housing impacts Black, brown, marginalized communities, which was a fact of reality in Grand Rapids, Michigan. A lot of people were being priced out of homes, were intermittently homeless, living out of their cars or in hotels. Meanwhile, the downtown area was developing all these new wonderful breweries and loft houses, loft spaces, apartments. So the Boom and the Bust, I wanted to reflect those two narratives. My site was in downtown, directly across from their contemporary art museum. And so I was looking at combining, again, these narratives into kind of a simple form, looking at Art Deco and brutalism as kind of indicative of this large-scale, present, permanent building, and then bifurcated by these sort of smaller homes in red, which often indicates a kind of negative statistic. I was looking at the car versus, more simpler design. And went with the kind of, again, simple, steel and aluminum framing. Really, I wanted to, again, represent, for me, I think the thing that most indicates development is the intermediary stage or the construction phase. When you walk around your neighborhood and there's sidewalk sheds and there's scaffolding everywhere, it really gives that impending sense of this new building, new development coming. So I wanted to use that same raw material language in it. And then again, it's split by these smaller single-family homes, these little models, these red single-family homes. Again, embodying this idea of these not competing narratives, but simultaneous narratives where the negative one is very often overlooked, right? But it's very much a part of how the former is allowed and gets to be implemented, right? So another project, this occurred right before the pandemic, was Rot, Knit, Labors and Legacies. It was the SAIC program for Alexandria, Virginia, and the King Street Waterfront Park. And so I think I was the second artist to do this program. And so the interesting thing about Alexandria, Virginia that I didn't know, it was the kind of the capital of the domestic slave trade. It had slave trading offices, which were, again, the most prominent one in the United States. I think many of us, I know myself, was more familiar with the Atlantic slave trade, less so with the domestic slave trade of, the enslaved arriving and then being sent down south. And in terms of these kind of interconnected narratives you can't disentangle, Alexandria, Virginia is this beautiful town right across the Potomac River, Potomac, and it has all these wonderful artisanal shops and vintage. It's just this beautiful, these cobblestone streets, but right there is this really deep, insidious history of slavery, and its kind of commercial interests were very much connected to the slave trade, both the labor of enslaved individuals and the selling, right? So they're simultaneously individuals, commodities, labors. So I created these 4 sculptures of these individuals looking out towards the river that kind of drew on the, the wrought iron aesthetic of a lot of the, area, creating these intricate kind of designs that reflected the 4 major industries, commercial industries of Alexandria, Virginia, embodied in these figures that were deeply connected to it. And then it was on a plaza where I had a local street artist paint a kind of quilted design, again drawing from the freedom quilts and their relationship to creative storytelling within, Black history, of course extending back to the continent and, African textile history as well. And so at night they were lit with these solar lights that were very low because I wanted it to be much more about these very stark silhouettes against the kind of night sky, so you can see how it would look in the evening. And that's one of my little tricks I told Amanda too when we got the Shirley Chisholm. I was like, no other artist is going to do a rendering of this thing at night. And that's how we win. Because they're just thinking the best of all circumstances, but we're gonna let them know we're thinking of what it's gonna look like at night. Because we're architects and we think of all of it. So it happened just before the pandemic. I did not get to see it during the run, but it was really incredibly exciting to see public engagement with it. And it was perfect because it was an open space, it was outside, so people were down there every day walking their dogs. Someone has a great little picture of like the little fluffy Pomeranian, whatever, chilling there. And people could engage at different levels, right? There was information explaining a little bit more about, what the project was about. And this is a project I did in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So another reason why I love public art is it really brings me to different cities and towns throughout the US. This is a very big country. I know I forget, everyone's always trying to go to, Mexico or out here, but America's so big, there's so many places. So, and this is the community, the North Side neighborhood, another shout out to my brothers, where Zion is from. I forget his last name, the ball player, right? And this is his community. And Butterfly Creek is adjacent to this project. And I was kind of commissioned by Northside Development Group. But they had a local community really there called the Explorers that I worked with, the Voyagers that I worked with, who were there to kind of like make sure that developers do not displace the community there. And that's something for me that's incredibly important as I do public art projects. I've admittedly done public art projects that like commemorate Black neighborhoods that they've displaced, and I've been hired by the displacing agents to create, I feel funky about it, right? So I think through, but this was really about a community that was really wanted to commemorate this kind of North Side neighborhood and was really working very closely to make sure that anything they implemented would benefit longtime residents. So I took the form of the butterfly, but also, and then laid it out in these kind of 4 concentric circles that really reflected the values that they were trying to bring to the community from education, health, housing, and employment. So created these 4 spheres that would be kind of zones where people could both sit and reflect, and they could host different, community engagements in this space. And so this is what it ended up looking like. It was a kind of tricky project. I had to redesign it several times because the pandemic raised the cost of materials, doubled them. So, when I had first designed it, this $500,000 budget thing, became, you can only do it for $800, so I had to fine tune it and whittle it down, but created these sort of like bench spaces and this ground pattern. And it was actually very much a rewarding experience to work with the community. Again, North Side is the name of the community, so I created this large astrolabe beacon, a kind of north lodestar. But yeah, this is one of my favorite projects. I think I finished this in early 2023. And you can see an aerial of kind of what it looks like there. So returning now to the projects that I've been working on for a while now. So you know, the Shanty Megastructures was my first kind of sci-fi inspired foray into worldcraft in the continent. And folks were like, you know, you've been a long-time Brooklyn resident. I've been there for 24 years. I wanted to kind of return that same sort of approach and understanding of kind of developing these sci-fi worlds to this Brooklyn community that I've lived in, Crown Heights, for such a long time. Again, this started during the pandemic, so I went around taking pictures. This is actually from my roof, looking directly across the street, and I developed this you know, intervention, this community intervention housing and market called Bodega Eco Haven. I've also been very fascinated with reflecting what I'm calling like vanishing ephemera, right? Even my local bodega got a facelift as the neighborhood gets more gentrified. So that very New York aesthetic, right? They like tore it down, made like this glass and steel, you know, kind of very clean, no more handwritten signs, you know. So I want to recapture that in the work as well. And so this is looking back in the other direction from my roof and creating these sort of like really immersive green spaces. And these, you know, so I went around taking a bunch of pictures, you know, in my neighborhood. This is in Bed-Stuy, a few blocks from where I live. Sort of air gaps between buildings. I created what is this bubble farm, a kind of microclimate for growing vegetation and produce that may not be native to the environment of, you know, the Northeast in New York. So really these sort of green technologies and interventions. That developed into the Frozen Neighborhoods, which was my project, as Dres mentioned, at the MoMA the Reconstructions exhibit Blackness in America. It was 12 artists / architects could select cities that they really wanted to reimagine and think through. So I selected Brooklyn, and when I lecture now about these works, particularly architecture schools, I compare it to the project that I did for the Venice Architectural Biennial, the Protopian Parallel, because they both look at mobility. So in the first iteration, the Brooklyn sense, it's about restricted mobility, and the Venice project is about hypermobility. And so, again, this project was called the Frozen Neighborhoods, and it was really the premise, and again, I collaborated with my boy Matty Vaz, who's a historian, so he kind of reinforces my project with critical rigor and gives me really important narrative to make it, you know, make it real. And so the idea is that a mobility credit system was established in the early 70s that was granted to individuals and families, and it would limit how far, how frequently, how often you could travel, right? But he decided to make it at the behest of the capitalist free market. So rich people could buy up mobility credits, poorer communities could pool them and sell them to create capital. So the idea is that's what they did in the 70s, and by the mid-1990s, the Brooklyn Frozen Neighborhoods came about. And so this was my little footprint there in MoMA. It was truncated again due to the pandemic, so I had two sides of this wall. And so I created a full-scale model of what would be the new subway map from a repurposed commercial mailbox that I actually purchased from the U.S. Postal Services and built in my kitchen. And then these more abstracted models, but these really detailed and immersive worlds. So again, I'm using the local language of the Brooklyn neighborhood, the bodega, and so the massive image was kind of a key legend describing all of the technologies. And so this is actually a photograph I took of a bodega up the street, but replaced all the advertising and signage with detailed information describing the entire project. So when I do these works, there's layers of information to people, for people to really sit and kind of work through and gain an understanding. Plant seeds, grow blessings, Brooklyn Interfaith Seed Vault. I reimagined the idea that, the different religious communities, the Pentecostal, Muslim, Jewish, came together to create seed vaults, right? To preserve and splice different kinds of seeds that individuals could grow that would then be distributed via these sort of drones. I looked at the idea of flooding and kind of in this world advanced the sort of climate crisis of flooding. So a lot of the major arteries and thoroughfares, I made these sort of freshwater corridors and all the activities that would occur therein. And the idea is that a lot of the technology is developed and coded by young kids who are, who occupy this LIRR substation. Again, these are all, the foundation of these images are literal photographs that I've taken throughout the neighborhood. So I actually went to the East New York abandoned substation and took photographs and then really layered in a lot of this detailed, information in 3D. So the idea is that all of the tech runs out of these substations. And so another aspect was reappropriating the MTA, which stood for, Metropolitan Transit Authority, and in this world stands for Main Threshold Access. So now, because everyone's sort of sheltering in space, they've overtaken these subway cars and turned them into these sort of really detailed learning mobile kiosks. So the different subway lines like the ACE, the 123, the what have you, BQ, BQ, NR no longer go to destinations but describe things that you can learn there, right? So the ACE is like international calling, right? Africa, Caribbean, Europe, what have you. The 1 to 2 to 3 are like learning, so educational workshops. The 7 Q are like religious services, the 7, right? So there's like, and he said, peace to the gods. So these, these things are all, again, there's really an incredible amount of like fully immersive detail in this world. But again, it's about what happens when you can no longer, you're no longer free to move around, and you're no longer able to even consider the pretense of the things that government, local, federal are supposed to provide and the fail-safes they're supposed to put in place. So it's about community working within these really self-sustaining practices that, again, create a holistic relationship between the architecture, the various technology interventions, and the necessities of the community. So the East New York Greater Gateway is just a massive stack of these subway cars. It's sort of the central university of this world. And then a smaller iteration is the Franklin Avenue Shuttle Gateway triple stack. So different scales of where these activities take space. Next variations of these, I've expanded this. I imagine that they now connect with the upstate communities, which I'm calling the proto-farm communities of upstate New York. So there's a kind of indigenous knowledge exchange with the communities of Rochester, Buffalo, Ithaca, Seneca, et cetera. And the idea within this project is I'm revitalizing the kind of underutilized canal and railway system of New York to create this back and forth exchange between the Brooklyn frozen neighborhoods and the proto-farm communities. And so I started developing renderings of what that would look like, looking at things like bioforestry. One of the things I remember learning in like 10th grade world history was in the Western perception of advanced civilization was indicated by our move from hunter-gatherer to agrarian societies. And I think that shapes so much of the Western perception of architecture, of urban planning, of design, this idea of advancement being indicated by humankind's dominion over nature, as opposed to, again, a holistic, cohesive relationship with nature, has been imprinted in our minds, and that's what's the most advanced society, our ability to clear land, where bioforestry works with, the flora, the fauna of the area, and actually these forest farms persist for thousands of years because they're just careful engineering of, the local vegetation that actually provides food to people. And so I created this like large 8-foot map called a psychogeographic map that kind of combines moon cycles and planting cycles with, again, the sort of path line of the railway system and the canal system. So pivoting to ACE, the African Conservation Effort, and AAP, the All Africa Protoport for the Venice, if the former dealt with really inhibited mobility, this one dealt with another completely alternative world where the African continent not only gained independence from colonial rule, but completely kicked out the colonizers. And the neo-colonial arc of history, which dealt with, of course, relentless resource extraction from so many African countries, which caused the developments of all of these African countries. The most resource-rich countries, the most underdeveloped, face the most kind of corruption and violence, and it's very intentional. So not only, freedom from colonial rule, but true freedom from colonial rule and intervention. And so I wanted to root it in the golden era of travel. Because I have very fond memories of that. As mentioned, I was born in Nigeria. I left there when I was around 6, 7. My mom is from DC, and so we would fly back and forth to visit my grandparents. Back in those days, you could put small children on a plane by themselves, and they would make it across the ocean at JFK. Some flight attendants would make sure they weren't kidnapped and safely shuttle them to the next plane that would take them to DC. So I remember that vividly, and I wanted to really reflect, again, that kind of mid-century modernist aesthetic language, but really through the lens of this world. So I created my installation at Venice was a sort of abstracted departure lounge for one of the All Africa Protoports. So in my narrative, the African conservation effort was a kind of conglomerate of all the sort of various local environmental groups throughout the continent coming together to form this massive continent-wide institution that was very much concerned with the stewardship of, the environmental, and also a pursuit of alternate energy sources outside of oil. So in this world, algae becomes the product and everything that came out of that. And so in developing these algae technologies, they created the All Africa Protoports, which were these massive travel complexes that would be located on the coast of major coastal cities, so Dar es Salaam, Havana, New York, Los Angeles, Mombasa, Barranquilla, et cetera, et cetera. But this one is imagined in the Baratsi floodplain of Western Zambia. So there's also an aspect of tension to this, because it's a very localized community there with very long-held beliefs, but now this All-Africa Protoport is coming in and implementing this kind of new system. So that becomes part of the dialogue there. So I designed everything for this, even the furniture. And that's important to note because, like you mentioned, I won the Silver Lion, and that's due in part to providing benches and seats for the judges to sit on and put their bag down and take in the work. Again, see, I told, with Amanda, we're gonna do a night rendering. Same thing with this Venice thing. I'm allowed the judges to sit down because they're on their feet all day long between Giardini, Arsenale, it's a little shortcut. But very specifically, the seats are oversized because, my memory of this time is when I'm a 5-year-old kid and my feet are dangling off the edge. So I really wanted the adults to sit in the furniture the same way, basically be a child traveling. And again, it was a really immersive tableau of these detailed renderings, a massive map, these 3D models and maquettes, and then this large video wall, LED video wall, that acted as both a kind of terminal window out into the grounds, but also an experimental animation and also a comprehensive 13-minute long video essay that described how this world worked, as well as like advertisements, promotions, requests for job applications, really the idea you're, the way you would sit in an airport. So this is a rendering on the left of the Baratsi floodplain, this new all-Africa protoport. And these are the zero emissions wing ships cruising on in. On the left is the algal drift pool, which is sort of the kind of entryway into this rocketless suborbital travel, this magnetic levitation launch track that shoots these shuttles into a low orbit for this hyper travel. So again, the sort of juxtaposition between the frozen neighborhoods and this massive African world. I was replacing the term diaspora with African world in this context. Particularly diaspora often refers to our our forced displacement from the continent. But in this condition, it's a sort of reclamation of the fact that so much of the African world exists throughout the globe. And they're now connected through these research African travel complexes. And so these are a series of technical systems illustrations that detail these inventions, the maglev monorail, again, the algal drift pool and launch track, the suborbital travel, and then the sort of both marine, coastal, and ocean and freshwater research centers. And then again, just really placing people into the scene. So this is a jet bridge approach to a kind of shuttle that would bring you to the suborbital launch. This is, approaching the baggage claim in, what would be the Los Angeles All-Africa protoport. And then again, a really massive map. This is like a 12-foot map that explain, I guess, like the flight times between these different protoports that is allowed by the suborbital travel. And then again, just a lot more detailed information about how these systems operate and work. And then a series of things I was calling like the employee of the month wall for different gardeners and flight attendants and shuttles. So I had, again, just so many different kind of visual experiences that really brought you into this elaborate eco-fiction. These maquettes, again, that's a conductor. And again, the idea that you would be, in this sort of fictional departure lounge. And so these are wonderful, this was the opening weekend of this, and it was just really incredible to see, everyone come in and engage with the work. In the upper left-hand corner is me and the architect Francis Kere, and he actually gave me his number and said, hit me up, so I gotta do that. He's doing things, and he has been for a while. And in the middle there is Norman Foster, kind of just cruising through. I don't think he looked at the work. I think he's like, this isn't architecture. And then on the far right is a group called the Black Females in Architecture. They're a UK-based group of exactly what the name says. And so I think we're approaching time. I mean, I have a lot more. This is a Sharjah project, but I don't know. Should we keep going or questions? What do y'all think? 5 more minutes. Okay. So this is another project that I did for the Sharjah Architectural Biennial, and this is 2023 as well. So that was a really, really busy year. And so similar to the kind of, atemporal alternate past, I really wanted to look at the city of Sharjah in the UAE and reimagine a kind of alternate timeline that sort of veered from the discovery of oil in the region and how that completely transformed this city from a kind of small fishing village. Sharjah's main export at the time was fishing and pearl diving, and then rapidly the development from the 60s through the 70s, due to oil being found in the region, transformed the urban landscape, the architecture. Now buildings are, triple, double height with, air conditioners off, so much Western influence, and kind of reflecting how that architecture was transformed. It was in the old Jubail market, so this kind of like very linear corridor, in which there was no sort of privileged entry point, It was a kind of an open air space where you can come in from one side. So I wanted to create a series of renderings that would tell the story, whether you came from the left side or the right side. So again, a series of these renderings and these maquettes. I looked very specifically at the Bank Street area of Sharjah. It's where a lot of their financial institutions, a lot of the Western institutions, but also it's called a heritage area, where there's a attempt at reclaiming the kind of architectural heritage of Sharjah, but it's really more of a sort of historical pastiche because of a lot of the, kind of environmental architectural approaches like the claustra blocks, the loud ventilation, and the wind towers that created cooling. They rebuilt the buildings in a style, but the wind tower is not functional. It actually hides the HVAC system. So it's a hilarious way of attempting to recapture this architectural history and this, city identity, but in a way that actually isn't making use. So what I did was completely transform that area and brought in the water from the lake into this canal system, into this massive plaza, both as a means of connecting, the sort of waterfront was incredibly important to Sharjah and its history. So I wanted to reconnect, bring that water, water back into this canal system. And so I made just this massive, urban planning of this plaza and these different sort of green technologies that reflect both the sort of, culture and society. And so, they're roughly about this, 16 cubic inches. The automated date dispenser, the wandering voodoo station, ablution station that kind of travels around the plaza and, sort of replenishes the water through these these irrigable pavers, aero mist towers. So again, I also had a sort of very detailed video essay to explain how all these different technologies works and the history that really brought you again into this world. And then, really looking at early Islamic city and town planning, and then bringing the kind of canal system through there. And so, this is similar to the All Africa Protoport project, which takes place in 1972. This reimagines the alternate timeline from 1972, which was the founding of the Department in Town Survey and Planning of Sharjah, to the cricket 1989 Champions cricket game, which is very kind of central to a kind of the social community and kind of pastime of Sharjah. It's a very heavily cricket-centric space. And so these are, again, just glimpses, the Dhow Driftway. So turning the traditional Dhow fishing boats into a sort of hydrofoil taxis that navigate around the plaza and through the various neighborhoods. The Al Hayat Hollow Garden, again, those really refreshing garden courtyards, which are so much a part of kind of the communal, public, and private gathering spaces. And again, I was looking at a lot of the construction signage of the time that would reference the new, the new architectures, the new developments that were coming. So that was part of kind of when you walked through the exhibit, you would see these signs as well. So yeah, this is again a very kind of exciting project to really reimagine. I've been, particularly the advent of Afrofuturism gaining such wide popularity, specifically after Black Panther. There's this sort of revivified or new interest in sci-fi, but I've again, going all the way back to my thesis, I've been much more interested in, a kind of nonlinear understanding of futurity, of technological advancement, of history, a way of reimagining and reinterpreting, historical buildings and conditions as a sort of space for thinking through a really sort of generative worldcraft that imagines possibilities. It's not about a kind of speculating a far-flung future. So much of all of these things we already exist. It's just hasn't been prioritized in terms of how we consider development. And so I've been doing a lot of that through my work. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Back there.
Hi. Do you use AI? And if not, would you be open to ever using it?
I actually do use AI. I use it to create characters now, right? Because, and it's something that when I have more time, I actually discuss, and Andres and anyone else in the architecture school tell you how difficult it has been to find Black scale characters to put into your architectural projects. Before AI, I literally would dedicate hours on end to finding as many scale figures as I could find. And I actually upload and make them available to schools, because you'll see someone be like, here's my project in Kinshasa, and it's like Swedish looking folks pushing strollers. So I find AI to be a great way to be able to develop characters and really specify and detail the characters. And I also use it as an asset builder. So a lot of the things that I don't think people really understand how collage these scenes are. I don't model everything. I download them from like SketchUp Marketplace, you know what I mean? But now with AI, I can generate kind of assets and imagery that I may use in scenes. So I've been using it as kind of an asset builder. Any other questions? Oh, we got one over there.
Laura.
Oh.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk, man. Question about your public artwork. So you talked about sort of a process of engaging with community to sort of figure out what the content or the process is going to be. Just curious about like what that looks like. How do you engage before you start or complete a project?
No, that's a great question, and it's for me it's very important, because I'm very well aware that when I go to these communities and these cities that I'm an artist from not there, and there's always going to be that pushback from a lot of the, and justifiably so. Why are we getting this guy from New York? We got great artists here, you know what I mean? So what I do is first thing I do is I'm very transparent about letting people know that I'm very aware that I'm an outside artist coming in, and I'm transparent about the process. And I usually ask different local community members to find, local communities, organizations, schools, churches, assisted living homes I've even done, you know what I mean, or historical societies, that I can sit down and have, that I can meet with. Oftentimes it's like multi-generational. Oftentimes, like in Seattle, in the project I'm doing in Seattle, there's a strong Somali community in the area, and there's a strong Vietnamese community as well. So I made a point to meet with both, and kind of get a sense of, first I kind of walk through what public art is and how it works now. It really is a kind of new field in terms of how it operates now. And I just tell them what a public, what large-scale public art commissions and projects look like, and I take them through my work, and I explain, how I develop my ideas. And then I usually do a kind of design charrette workshop with them where I ask them to reflect on the things that they find important and that they value about their community, or that they feel that maybe they want the younger generation to know about, and the younger generation maybe they want the older, you know what I mean? And like, what do you value here? What indicates a kind of a space of safety for you, of upliftment, of, or how would you feel, what would you want to have commemorated and shown? And so I try and incorporate that. And I'm also very clear that I'm the artist, that it ain't a group project. You know what I mean? Like, I make that very, like I said, that's part of the transparency. Like, we're not here to you want me to put your goldfish in this. This isn't that. But let's have a conversation. And I will do my best to, create work that I think people can feel seen and proud of, and that's my approach to it. And I'll do like maybe 3 or 4 community engagements. Yeah. Going once, going
Laura,
twice.
in the front.
Oh, okay.
Hi. For folks who work in kind of science fiction or even parafictional features, I always like to ask, what do you read? What do you watch? What do you pay attention to? What's exciting to you in media?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I'm heavily influenced by a lot of what I read. Nnedi Okorafor is one. China Miéville has been a huge influence, I think, particularly Perdido Street Station, just the descriptions of this like steampunk, Victorian punk, ad hoc, salvage punk aesthetic, but also his book, The City in the City, which I've used as reference over and over again because it looks at, it's a fascinating concept of 2 cities that occupy the exact same geographic space, but there's a very convoluted process, bureaucratic process of how you go from one city to the other. And inhabitants of these 2 cities, it is illegal, it's called breach, to acknowledge inhabitants of the other. And so it's very specific about how, though, for instance, there'd be inhabitants of those 2 cities sitting here in this lecture tonight, and they speak a different language, dress slightly differently, but it's almost like the children learn from very young how to navigate this space and reflect that they're in this very specific city. And that for me was like Brooklyn, because I moved to Brooklyn in 2000 and I saw it transform. Literally, I've lived in the same neighborhood, Crown Heights, since 2000. And my friend Kenny grew up in Crown Heights, so when I went to school in 95, instead of going back to the LA where I went to high school, I would often come to Crown Heights. So I've been coming there since 95 and seen this neighborhood transform. And all of a sudden I see this influx of new individuals, but there's still a lot of the longtime residents there. And I watch them completely not interact at all. There's like bodegas that the folks who've lived there go into, and then there's one here that the new residents go to. So I'm seeing this happen. So for me, it's become a great, again, you've seen through my work, I'm interested in these narratives, these simultaneously occurring narratives, right? So, that kind of thing has been a huge influence.
Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you for everything. This is great to kind of just hear you talk about, kind of watch on the side. We've interacted over time. I just have one observation, and it's an ill-formed question and comment, but I'm really interested in maybe the Western imagination's sense of the future of Africa as a fiction, right? And I think that there's something about that people might be drawn to the work because they see it as like almost impossible, right? And not that it is, but that in the Western imagination, this level of development, this amazing technology, the Wakandas just wouldn't exist, right? It exists at a level of fiction. So I'm just curious, as you've been doing this work over the arc of your career, are you seeing the Francis Carries and other folks, are you seeing people think differently about architecture and development on the continent, and in particular Nigeria?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think it's interesting because, when I was doing this work in the early part of my career, and actually the shanty megastructures, I think probably propelled me more than anything that I've ever done. And it's because of the reception to that work, which is kind of funny. People just hadn't seen it before, hadn't seen that engagement with the continent very particularly and specifically. I mean, we saw the response to when the plane flies into Wakanda, right? That kind of like, whoa, which is simultaneously like preposterous, right? There hasn't been that, you know what I mean? But really that was the draw. And so early on, after I created shanty megastructures, which is why the kids from Lagos were like ruin porn for Western consumption, because I was getting invited places to discuss this work, you know what I mean? I got invited, you know what I mean? I was invited by this German think tank, and there was like a robotics engineer from MIT, and the director of sub-Saharan housing for the UN was there, and they're both, one was from Nairobi, and I think the other one from, I think Joburg, right? So there was like, I was being invited into these conversations. I remember at the time I told my mom, like, here are all these big names, again, like director at the UN, and then they invite Lake. I'm like, why am I here? Why me? And my mom's like, because you're important, and you're doing important work. No. He's like, no. The impact of your work is not about the easily quantifiable aspects about it, but the reverberations of the imagery that you are producing that really allows, allows people to engage in that way. When I did my thesis, I won't name the professor, but one of my professors was like, why are you doing this convoluted clinical thing with the continent? Why don't you make a museum to house African sculptures? And to her, that was more engaging with the that was more engaging with, and I was like, no. Why would I do that? No. So I think, and that's part of the kind of restrictive, racist understanding of it, is simultaneously, even when the continent is revered and it's again behind the glass vitrine, there's not an engagement. When on the continent, these artifacts are not artifacts, they're deeply connected to the way these communities operate and function and believe. And so seeing someone produce work that engages directly with that isn't my health center NGO that I'm gonna build here, or my, you know what I mean, has been inspired. So when I did the walkthrough with Francis Carey, he was like, yo, this is dope. He was like, and I'm like, yo, this is dope. You're the man, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think people have been really energized. Again, even when the work has been problematic, right? There's still, like Wale said, like, I don't think anyone here in Lagos would have done anything like this. But he saw the vision, because he, at the time, blew up on Twitter because he did Nigerians at Hogwarts. So he was kind of like, he like this was a viral thing that happened on Twitter. So he was already like waiting for, people not to be afraid to get messy with to get messy with the continent. I think, so many of us feel nervous about, again, in like engaging in that way. I know I'm just rambling, but I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Lake. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming out. Much appreciated.